East, the rise of Islam. Chapter outline and focus questions. The rise of Islam. What were the main tenets of Islam, and how does the religion compare with Judaism and Christianity? The Arab Empire and its successors. Why did the Arabs undergo such a rapid expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries, and why were they so successful in creating an empire? Islamic civilization. What were the main features of Islamic society and culture during its era of early growth? Critical thinking. In what ways did the arrival of Islam change or maintain the political, social, and cultural conditions that had existed in the area before Muhammad? Connections to today. Do the tactics and the motives that led to the Crusades provide any lessons for the conduct of foreign policy by the United States and its allies toward the Middle East today? If so, what are those lessons? In the year 570, in the Arabian city of Mecca, there was born a child named Muhammad whose life changed the course of world history. The son of a merchant, Muhammad grew to maturity in a time of transition. The Roman Empire, which had once been able to impose its hegemony over the Middle East, was only a distant memory. The region was now divided into many squabbling states, and the people adhered to many different faiths. According to tradition, the young Muhammad became deeply concerned at the corrupt and decadent society of his day and took to wandering in the hills outside the city to meditate on the conditions of his time. On one of these occasions, he experienced visions that he was convinced had been inspired by Allah. Muslims believe that this message was conveyed to him by the angel Gabriel, who commanded Muhammad to preach the revelations that he would be given. Eventually, they would be transcribed into the Quran, the holy book of Islam, and provide inspiration to millions of people throughout the world. According to popular belief, Gabriel also took Muhammad, mounted on his faithful steed Burak, on a mystical night journey to heaven, where Allah introduced him to paradise and hell so that on his return to earth he could instruct the faithful on their prospects in the next world. Within a few decades of Muhammad's death, the Middle East was united once again. The initial triumph may have been primarily political and military, based on the transformative power of a dynamic new religion that inspired thousands of devotees to extend their faith to neighboring regions. In any event, Islamic beliefs and culture exerted a powerful influence in all areas occupied by Arab armies. Initially, Arab beliefs and customs, as reflected through the prism of Muhammad's teachings, transformed the societies and cultures of the peoples living in the new empire. But eventually, the distinctive political and cultural forces that had long characterized the region began to reassert themselves. Factional struggles led to the decline and then the destruction of the empire. Still, the Arab conquest left a powerful legacy that survived the decline of Arab political power. The ideological and emotional appeal of Islam remained strong throughout the Middle East and eventually extended into areas not occupied by Arab armies, such as the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The rise of Islam. Focus question: what were the main tenets of Islam, and how does the religion compare with Judaism and Christianity? The Arabs were a Semitic-speaking people of southwestern Asia with a long history. They were mentioned in Greek sources of the 5th century BCE and even earlier in the Old Testament. The Greek historian Herodotus had applied the name Arab to the entire peninsula, calling it Arabia. In 106 BCE, the Romans extended their authority to the Arabian Peninsula, transforming it into a province of their growing empire. During Roman times, the region was inhabited primarily by the Bedouin Arabs, nomadic peoples who came originally from the northern part of the peninsula. Bedouin society was organized on a tribal basis. The ruling member of the tribe was called the Sheikh and was selected from one of the leading families by a council of elders called the Majlis. The Sheikh ruled the tribe with the consent of the council. Each tribe was autonomous but felt a general sense of allegiance to the larger unity of all the clans in the region. In early times, the Bedouins had supported themselves primarily by sheep herding or by raiding passing caravans, but after the domestication of the camel during the second millennium BCE, the Bedouins began to participate in the caravan trade themselves and became major carriers of goods between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. The Arabs of pre-Islamic times were polytheistic, with a supreme god known as Allah presiding over a community of spirits. It was a communal faith involving all members of the tribe and had no priesthood. Spirits were believed to inhabit natural objects such as trees, rivers, and mountains, while the supreme deity was symbolized by a sacred stone. Each tribe possessed its own stone, but by the time of Muhammad, a massive black meteorite, housed in a central shrine called the Kaaba in the commercial city of Mecca, had come to possess especially sacred qualities. In the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the economic importance of the Arabian Peninsula began to increase. As a result of the political disorder in Mesopotamia, a consequence of the constant wars between the Eastern Roman, Byzantine, and Sasanian Persian empires, and in Egypt, the trade routes that ran directly across the peninsula or down the Red Sea became increasingly perilous, and a third route, which passed from the Mediterranean through Mecca to Yemen and then by ship across the Indian Ocean, became more popular. The communities in that part of the peninsula benefited from the change and took a larger share of the caravan trade between the Mediterranean and the countries on the other side of the Indian Ocean. As a consequence, relations between the Bedouins of the desert and the increasingly wealthy merchant class of the towns began to become strained. The role of Muhammad. Into this world came Muhammad, also known as Muhammad, a man whose spiritual visions unified the Arab world with a speed no one would have suspected possible. Unfortunately, there is almost no verifiable evidence relating to Muhammad's life. As a result, historians must rely on a limited number of sources, including the Quran and testimonials about his life by his followers, the Hadith. These sources were extensively revised after his death, however, and may have been shaped so as to favor the interests of his successors. Consequently, to many historians of the Middle East, the first years of Islam remain a matter of debate and conjecture. Born in Mecca to a merchant family and orphaned at the age of 6, Muhammad, 570 to 632, grew up to become a caravan manager and eventually married a rich widow, Khadija, who was also his employer. A member of the local Hashemite clan of the Qurayshi tribe, he lived in Mecca as a merchant for several years but, according to tradition, was apparently troubled by the growing gap between the Bedouin values of honesty and generosity and the acquisitive behavior of the affluent commercial elites in the city. Deeply concerned, he began to visit the nearby hills to meditate in isolation. It was there that he encountered the angel Gabriel, who commanded him to preach the revelations that he would be given. It is said that Muhammad was acquainted with Jewish and Christian beliefs and came to believe that while Allah had already revealed himself in part through Moses and Jesus, and thus through the Hebraic and Christian traditions, the final revelations were now being given to him. Out of his revelations, which were eventually dictated to scribes, came the Quran, meaning recitation, also spelled Quran, the holy scriptures of Islam, meaning submission, implying submission to the will of Allah. The Quran contained the guidelines by which followers of Allah, known as Muslims, practitioners of Islam, were to live. Like the Christians and the Jewish, Muslims, also known as Muslims, were a people of the book, believers in a faith based on scripture. Muslims believed that after returning home, Muhammad set out to comply with Gabriel's command by preaching to the residents of Mecca about his revelations. At first, many were convinced that he was a madman or a charlatan. Others were likely concerned that his vigorous attacks on traditional beliefs and the corrupt society around him might severely shake the social and political order. After 3 years of proselytizing, he had only 30 followers. Discouraged, perhaps, by the systematic persecution of his followers, which was allegedly undertaken with a brutality reminiscent of the cruelties suffered by early Christians, as well as the failure of the Meccans to accept his message. In 622, Muhammad and some of his closest supporters, mostly from his own Hashemite clan, left the city and retreated north to the rival city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina, or City of the Prophet. That flight, known in history as the Hijrah, marks the first date on the official calendar of Islam. At Medina, Muhammad failed in his original purpose, to convert the Jewish community in Medina to his beliefs. But he was successful in winning support from many residents of the city as well as from Bedouins in the surrounding countryside. From this mixture, he formed the first Muslim community, the Ummah. Returning to his birthplace at the head of a considerable military force, Muhammad conquered Mecca and converted the townspeople to the new faith. In 630, he made a symbolic visit to the Kaaba, where he declared it a sacred shrine of Islam and ordered the destruction of the idols of the traditional faith. See the film and history feature The Message, Muhammad, the Messenger of God, 1976, above. The teachings of Muhammad. Like Christianity and Judaism, Islam is monotheistic. Allah is the all-powerful being who created the universe and everything in it. Islam is also concerned with salvation and offers the hope of an afterlife. Those who hope to achieve it must subject themselves to the will of Allah. Unlike Christianity, Islam makes no claim to the divinity of its founder. Muhammad, like Abraham, Moses, and other figures of the Old Testament, was a prophet, but he was also a man like other men. Because, according to the Quran, earlier prophets had corrupted his revelations, Allah sent his complete revelation through Muhammad. At the heart of Islam is the Quran, with its basic message that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. Consisting of 114 surahs, chapters, drawn together by a committee established after Muhammad's death, the Quran is not only the sacred book of Islam but also an ethical guidebook and a code of law and political theory combined. As it evolved, Islam developed a number of fundamental tenets. Of primary importance is the need to obey the will of Allah. This means following a basic ethical code that consists of what are popularly termed the 5 pillars of Islam: belief in Allah and Muhammad as his prophet, standard prayer 5 times a day, and public prayer on Friday at midday to worship Allah, observance of the holy month of Ramadan, including fasting from dawn to sunset, making a pilgrimage, known as the Hajj, to Mecca at least once in one's lifetime, if possible, and giving alms, called zakat, to the poor and unfortunate. The faithful who observe the law are guaranteed a place in an eternal paradise, a vision of a luxurious and cool garden shared by some versions of Eastern Christianity, with the sensuous delights so obviously lacking in the Arabian desert. Islam is not just a set of religious beliefs, but a way of life as well. After the death of Muhammad, a panel of Muslim scholars, known as the Ulma, drew up a law code called the Sharia to provide believers with a set of prescriptions to regulate their daily lives. Much of the Sharia was drawn from existing legal regulations or from the Hadith, a collection of the sayings of the Prophet that was used to supplement the revelations contained in the Holy Scriptures. Believers are subject to strict behavioral requirements. In addition to the 5 pillars, Muslims are forbidden to gamble, eat pork, drink alcoholic beverages, or engage in dishonest behavior. Sexual mores are also strict. Contacts between unmarried men and women are discouraged, and ideally, marriages are arranged by the parents. In accordance with Bedouin custom, polygyny is permitted, but Muhammad attempted to limit the practice by restricting males to no more than 4 wives. The degree to which the traditional account of the exposition and inner meaning of the Quran can stand up to historical analysis is a matter of debate. As explained earlier, the circumstances surrounding the life of Muhammad and his role in founding the religion of Islam remain highly speculative, and many Muslims may be concerned that the consequences of rigorous examination might undercut key tenets of the Muslim faith. One problem is that the earliest known versions of the Quran available today do not contain the diacritical marks that modern Arabic uses to clarify meaning. So much of the sacred text is ambiguous and open to varying interpretations. The Arab Empire and its successors. Focus question: why did the Arabs undergo such a rapid expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries, and why were they so successful in creating an empire? The death of Muhammad presented his followers with a dilemma. Although Muhammad had not claimed divine qualities, Muslims saw no separation between political and religious authority. Submission to the will of Allah meant submission to his prophet, Muhammad. According to the Quran, whoso obeyeth the messenger obeyeth Allah. Muhammad's charismatic authority and political skills had been at the heart of his success. But Muslims have never agreed on whether he named a successor, and although he had several daughters, he left no sons. In the male-oriented society of his day, who would lead the community of the faithful? Shortly after Muhammad's death, a number of his closest followers selected Abu Bakr, a wealthy merchant from Medina who was Muhammad's father-in-law and one of his first supporters, as Khalifa, literally successor. The Caliph was the temporal leader of the Islamic community and was also considered, in general terms, to be a religious leader, or imam. Under Abu Bakr's prudent leadership, the movement succeeded in suppressing factional tendencies among some of the Bedouin tribes in the peninsula and began to direct its attention to wider fields. Muhammad had used the Arabic tribal custom of the Rajia, or raid, in the struggle against his enemies. Now his successors turned to the same custom to expand the authority of the movement. When historians of the Middle East today discuss the expansion of Islam after the death of Muhammad, the Arabic term jihad is often used to describe the process. The word appears in the Quran on several occasions, and it appears to have had multiple meanings, much as the word crusade does in English. Sometimes jihad is used in the sense of striving in the way of the Lord, as a means of exhorting believers to struggle against the evil within themselves. In other cases, however, it has been translated as holy war, justifying hostile action against the enemies of Islam. In that sense, the word can be used to describe the expansion of the world of Islam into the realm of the unbelievers. Many Islamic terrorist movements of the present day clearly view jihad in the latter sense, an interpretation that many other Muslims vigorously reject. Because the word is so heavily laden with emotional connotations, it clearly should be used sparingly and with care. Creation of an empire. Once the Arabs had become unified under Muhammad's successor, they began directing against neighboring peoples the energy they had formerly directed against each other. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires were the first to feel the strength of the newly united Arabs, now aroused to a peak of zeal by their common faith. In 636, the Muslims defeated the Byzantine army on the Yarmouk River, north of the Dead Sea. 4 years later, they took possession of the Byzantine province of Syria. In 640, they conquered Cairo. To the east, the Arabs defeated a Persian force in 637 and then went on to conquer the entire empire of the Sassanids by 650. In the meantime, the rest of Egypt and other areas of North Africa were also brought under Arab authority. What accounts for this rapid expansion of the Arabs after the rise of Islam in the early 7th century? Historians have proposed various explanations, ranging from a prolonged drought on the Arabian Peninsula to the desire of Islam's leaders to channel the energies of their new converts. Others have suggested that the Byzantine Empire had been weakened by a plague epidemic that had not affected the desert regions farther to the east. Still another hypothesis is that the expansion was deliberately planned by the ruling elites in Mecca to extend their trade routes and bring surplus-producing regions under their control. Whatever the case, Islam's ability to unify the Bedouin peoples certainly played a role. Although the Arab triumph was made substantially easier by the ongoing conflict between the Byzantine and Persian empires, which had weakened both powers, the strength and mobility of the Bedouin armies with their much-wanted cavalry should not be overlooked. Led by a series of brilliant generals, the Arabs assembled a large, highly motivated army whose valor was enhanced by the belief that Muslim warriors who died in battle were guaranteed a place in paradise. Once the army had prevailed, Arab civilian administration of the conquered areas was applied. Although early sources often portrayed the conquest in violent terms, many historians today portray the process as generally, but not universally, tolerant. Sometimes, due to a shortage of trained Arab administrators, government was left to local officials. Conversion to Islam was usually voluntary in accordance with the maxim in the Quran that there shall be no compulsion in religion. Those who chose not to convert, however, were required to submit to Muslim rule and to pay a head tax in return for exemption from military service, which was required of all Muslim males. Under such conditions, the local populations often regarded Arab rule as preferable to Byzantine rule or that of the Sassanid dynasty in Persia. Furthermore, the simple and direct character of the new religion and its egalitarian qualities, all people were viewed as equal in the eyes of Allah, were very likely attractive to peoples throughout the region. The rise of the Umayyads. The main challenge to the growing empire came from within. Some of Muhammad's followers had not agreed with the selection of Abu Bakr as the first caliph and promoted the candidacy of Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, as an alternative. Ali's claim was ignored by other leaders, however, and after Abu Bakr's death, the office passed to Umar, another of Muhammad's followers. In 656, Umar's successor, Uthman, was assassinated, and Ali, who happened to be in Medina at the time, was finally selected for the position. But according to tradition, Ali's rivals were convinced that he had been implicated in the death of his predecessor, and a factional struggle broke out within the Muslim leadership. In 661, Ali himself was assassinated, and Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and one of Ali's chief rivals, replaced him in office. Muawiyah thereupon made the caliphate hereditary in his own family, called the Umayyads, who were a branch of the Qurayshi clan. The new caliphate, with its capital at Damascus, remained in power for nearly a century. The factional struggle within Islam did not bring an end to Arab expansion. At the beginning of the 8th century, new attacks were launched at both the western and the eastern ends of the Mediterranean world. Arab armies advanced across North Africa and conquered the Berbers, a primarily pastoral people living along the Mediterranean coast and in the mountains in the interior. Muslim fleets attacked several islands in the eastern Mediterranean. Then, around 710, Arab forces, supplemented by Berber allies under their commander, Tariq, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and occupied southern Spain, thus the modern name of the Rock of Gibraltar, Jebel Tariq, or Tariq's Mountain. The Visigothic kingdom, already weakened by internecine warfare, quickly collapsed, and by 725, most of the Iberian Peninsula had become a Muslim state with its center in Andalusia. 7 years later, an Arab force, making a foray into southern France, was defeated by the army of Charles Martel between Tours and Poitiers. For the first time, Arab horsemen had met their match in a disciplined Frankish infantry. Some historians think that internal exhaustion would have forced the invaders to retreat even without their defeat at the hands of the Franks, the Germanic people who had established a kingdom in what is now France. In any event, the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, would be the high-water mark of Arab expansion in Europe. As Islamic power spread westward into the Mediterranean basin, the primary adversary for Arab forces was the Byzantine Empire. Because the Byzantines possessed a powerful fleet, many of the battles would inevitably take place at sea. Initially, the Arab ships would be at a substantial disadvantage, since the peoples of the peninsula, lacking protected harbors and sources of wood and iron for ships, had little experience at sea. They were quick to learn, however, and were soon competing on an equal basis with their opponents. Before the end of the 7th century, Arab fleets were able to seize a number of islands in the Mediterranean. In 717, a Muslim force launched an attack on Constantinople with the hope of destroying the Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantines' use of Greek fire, a petroleum-based compound containing quicklime and sulfur, destroyed the Muslim fleet, thereby saving the empire and indirectly Christian Europe, since the fall of Constantinople would have opened the door to an Arab invasion of Eastern Europe. The Byzantine Empire and Islam now established an uneasy frontier in southern Asia Minor. Arab power also extended to the east, consolidating Islamic rule in Mesopotamia and Persia and northward into Central Asia. But factional disputes continued to plague the empire. Many Muslims of non-Arab extraction resented the favoritism toward Arabs shown by local administrators. In some cases, resentment led to revolt, as in Iraq, where Ali's second son, Hussein, disputed the legitimacy of the Umayyads and incited his supporters, to be known in the future as Shiites. From the Arabic phrase Shi'at Ali, partisans of Ali, to rise up against Umayyad rule in 680. Hussein's forces were defeated, and with the death of Hussein in the battle, a schism between Shiite and Sunni, usually translated Orthodox, Muslims had been created that continues to this day. Umayyad rule created resentment, not only in Mesopotamia, but also in North Africa, where Berber resistance continued, especially in the mountainous areas south of the coastal plains. According to critics, the Umayyads may have contributed to their own demise by their decadent behavior. One caliph allegedly swam in a pool of wine and then imbibed enough of the contents to lower the level significantly. Finally, in 750, a revolt led by Abu al-Abbas, a descendant of Muhammad's uncle, led to the overthrow of the Umayyads and the establishment of the Abbasid dynasty, 750 to 1258, in what is now Iraq. The Abbasids. The Abbasid caliphs brought political, economic, and cultural change to the world of Islam, while seeking to implant their own version of religious orthodoxy. They tried to break down the distinctions between Arab and non-Arab Muslims. All Muslims were now allowed to hold both civil and military offices. This change helped open Islamic culture to the influences of the occupied civilizations. Some Arabs began to intermarry with the peoples they had conquered. In many parts of the Islamic world, notably North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, most Muslim converts began to consider themselves Arabs. In 762, the Abbasids built a new capital city at Baghdad on the Tigris River far to the east of the Umayyad capital at Damascus. The new capital was strategically positioned to take advantage of river traffic to the Persian Gulf and also lay astride the caravan route from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The move eastward allowed Persian influence to come to the fore, encouraging a new cultural orientation. Under the Abbasids, judges, merchants, and government officials, rather than warriors, were regarded as the ideal citizens. Abbasid rule. The new Abbasid Caliphate experienced a period of splendid rule well into the 9th century. Best known of the caliphs of the time was Harun al-Rashid, reigned 786 to 809, or Harun the Upright, whose reign is often described as the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate. His son al-Mamun reigned 813 to 833, was a patron of learning who founded an astronomical observatory and established a foundation for translating classical Greek works. This was also a period of growing economic prosperity. The Arabs had conquered many of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire and now controlled the routes to the east. Baghdad became the center of an enormous commercial market that extended into Europe, Central Asia, and Africa, greatly adding to the wealth of the Islamic world and promoting an exchange of culture, ideas, and technology from one end of the known world to the other. Paper was introduced from China and eventually passed on to North Africa and Europe. Crops from India and Southeast Asia, including rice, sugar, sorghum, and cotton, moved toward the west, while glass, wine, and indigo dye were introduced into China. Under the Abbasids, the caliphs became more regal. More kings than spiritual leaders, described by such august phrases as the Caliph of God, they ruled by autocratic means similar to those used by the kings and emperors in neighboring civilizations. A 13th century Chinese author, who compiled a world geography based on accounts by Chinese travelers, left the following description of one of the later caliphs. The king wears a turban of silk brocade and foreign cotton stuff, bakran. On each new moon and full moon, he puts on an 8-sided flat-topped headdress of pure gold, set with the most precious jewels in the world. His robe is of silk brocade and is bound around him with a jade girdle. On his feet he wears golden shoes. The king's throne is set with pearls and precious stones, and the steps of the throne are covered with pure gold. As the caliph took on more of the trappings of a hereditary autocrat, the bureaucracy assisting him in administering the expanding empire grew more complex as well. The caliph was advised by a council, called a divan, headed by a prime minister, known as a wazir. The caliph did not attend meetings of the divan in the normal manner, but sat behind a screen and then communicated his divine will to the vizier. Some historians have ascribed the change in the caliphate to Persian influence, which permeated the empire after the capital was moved to Baghdad. Persian influence was indeed strong. The mother of the Caliph Al-Mamun, for example, was a Persian, but more likely, the increase in pomp and circumstance was a natural consequence of the growing power and prosperity of the empire. Instability and division. Nevertheless, an element of instability lurked beneath the surface. The lack of spiritual authority may have weakened the caliphate and given impetus to potential rivals, and disputes over the succession were common. At Harun's death, the rivalry between his two sons, Amin and Al-Mamun, led to civil war and the destruction of Baghdad. As described by the 10th century Muslim historian Al-Masudi, mansions were destroyed, most remarkable monuments are obliterated, prizes sold. Brother turned his sword against brother, son against father, as some fought for Amin, others for Mamun. Houses and palaces fueled the flames, property was put to the sack. Wealth contributed to financial corruption. By awarding important positions to court favorites, the Abbasid caliphs began to undermine the foundations of their own power and eventually became mere figureheads. Under Harun al-Rashid, members of his Hashemite clan received large pensions from the state treasury, and his wife Zubaydah reportedly spent huge sums while shopping on a pilgrimage to Mecca. One powerful family, the Barmakids, amassed vast wealth and power until Harun al-Rashid eliminated the entire clan in a fit of jealousy. The life of luxury enjoyed by the caliph and other political and economic elites in Baghdad seemingly undermined the stern fiber of Arab society as well as the strict moral code of Islam. Strictures against sexual promiscuity were widely ignored, and caliphs were rumored to maintain thousands of concubines in their harems. Divorce was common, homosexuality was widely practiced, and alcohol was consumed in public despite Islamic law's prohibition against imbibing spirits. The process of disintegration was accelerated by changes that were taking place within the armed forces and the bureaucracy of the empire. Given the shortage of qualified Arabs for key positions in the army and the administration, the caliphate began to recruit officials from among the non-Arab peoples in the empire, such as Persians and Turks from Central Asia. These people gradually became a dominant force in the army and administration. Environmental problems added to the regime's difficulties. The Tigris and Euphrates river system, lifeblood of Mesopotamia for 3 millennia, was beginning to silt up. Bureaucratic inertia now made things worse, as many of the country's canals became virtually unusable, leading to widespread food shortages. The fragmentation of the Islamic Empire accelerated in the 10th century. Morocco became independent, and in 973, a new Shiite dynasty under the Fatimids was established in Egypt with its capital at Cairo. With increasing disarray in the empire, the Islamic world was held together only by the common commitment to the Arabic language and the Quran. The Seljuk Turks. In the 11th century, the Abbasid Caliphate faced yet another serious threat in the form of the Seljuk Turks. When the nomadic Zainu Empire fell apart early in the first millennium CE, Turkish-speaking people in the area gradually migrated westward into Zinjan and Central Asia. Some of them converted to Islam in the process. Eventually, one group, known as the Seljuk Turks, began to serve as military mercenaries for the Abbasid Caliphate, where they were known for their ability as mounted archers. Moving gradually into Persia and Armenia as the Abbasids weakened, the Seljuk Turks grew in number until by the 11th century, they were able to occupy the eastern provinces of the Abbasid Empire. In 1055, a Turkish leader captured Baghdad and assumed command of the empire with the title of Sultan, holder of power. While the Abbasid Caliph remained the chief representative of Sunni religious authority, the real military and political power of the state was in the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The latter did not establish their headquarters in Baghdad, which now entered a period of decline. As the historian Khatib Baghdadi described, "There is no city in the world equal to Baghdad in the abundance of its riches, the importance of its business, the number of its scholars and important people, the distinctions of its leaders and its common people, the extent of its palaces, inhabitants, streets, avenues, alleys, mosques, baths, docks and caravansaries, the purity of its air, the sweetness of its water, the freshness of its dew and its shade, the temperateness of its summer and winter, the healthfulness of its spring and fall, and its great swarming crowds. The buildings and the inhabitants were most numerous during the time of Harun al-Rashid, when the city and its surrounding areas were full of cool rooms, thriving places, fertile pastures, rich watering places for ships." Then the riots began. An uninterrupted series of misfortunes befell the inhabitants. Its flourishing conditions came to ruin to such extent that, before our time, and the century preceding ours, it found itself, because of the perturbation and the decadence it was experiencing, in complete opposition to all capitals and in contradiction to all inhabited countries. Baghdad would revive, but it would no longer be the gift of God of Harun al-Rashid. By the last decades of the 11th century, the Seljuks were exerting military pressure on Egypt and the Byzantine Empire. In 1071, when the Byzantines foolishly challenged the Turks, their army was routed at Manzikert, near Lake Van in eastern Turkey, and the victors took over much of the Anatolian peninsula. In dire straits, the Byzantine Empire turned to the west for help, setting in motion the papal pleas that led to the Crusades. In Europe, and undoubtedly within the Muslim world itself, the arrival of the Turks was initially regarded as a disaster. The Turks were viewed as barbarians who destroyed civilizations and oppressed populations. In fact, in many respects, Turkish rule in the Middle East was probably beneficial. After converting to Islam, the Turkish rulers temporarily brought an end to the fraternal squabbles between Sunni and Shiite Muslims while supporting the Sunnis. They put their energies into revitalizing Islamic law and institutions and provided much-needed political stability to the empire, which helped restore its former prosperity. Under Seljuk rule, Muslims began to organize themselves into autonomous brotherhoods, whose relatively tolerant practices characterized Islamic religious attitudes until the end of the 19th century, when increased competition with Europe led to confrontation with the West. Seljuk political domination over the old Abbasid Empire, however, provoked resentment on the part of many Persian Shiites, who viewed the Turks as usurping foreigners who had betrayed the true faith of Islam. Among the regime's most feared enemies was Hassan al-Sabah, a Karatrained Persian who formed a rebel group, popularly known as Assassins, Guardians, who for several decades terrorized government officials and other leading political and religious figures from their base in the mountains south of the Caspian Sea. Like their modern-day equivalents, the members of the terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda, Sabah's followers were highly motivated and were adept at infiltrating the enemy's camp to carry out their clandestine activities. The organization was finally eliminated by the invading Mongols in the 13th century. The Crusades. Just before the end of the 11th century, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I desperately called for assistance from other Christian states in Europe to protect his empire against the invading Seljuk Turks. As part of his appeal, he said that the Muslims were desecrating Christian shrines in the Holy Land and molesting Christian pilgrims en route to the shrines. In actuality, the Muslims had never threatened the shrines or cut off Christian access to them. But tension between Christendom and Islam was on the rise, and the Byzantine emperor's appeal received a ready response in Europe. Beginning in 1096 and continuing into the 13th century, a series of Christian raids on Islamic territories known as the Crusades brought the Holy Land and adjacent areas on the Mediterranean coast from Antioch to the Sinai Peninsula under Christian rule. At first, Muslim rulers in the area were taken aback by the invading Crusaders, whose armored cavalry presented a new challenge to local warriors, and their response was ineffectual. The Seljuk Turks by that time were preoccupied with events taking place farther to the east and took no action themselves. But in 1169, Sunni Muslims under the leadership of Saladin, vizier to the last Fatimid Caliph, brought an end to the Fatimid dynasty. Proclaiming himself Sultan, Saladin succeeded in establishing his control over both Egypt and Syria, thereby confronting the Christian states in the area with united Muslim power on two fronts. In 1187, Saladin's army invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem and destroyed the Christian forces concentrated there. Further operations reduced Christian occupation in the area to a handful of fortresses along the northern coast. Unlike the Christians of the First Crusade, who had slaughtered much of the population of Jerusalem when they captured the city, Saladin did not permit a massacre of the civilian population and even tolerated the continuation of Christian religious services in conquered territories. For a time, Christian occupation forces even carried on a lively trade relationship with Muslim communities in the region. The Christians returned for another try a few years after the fall of Jerusalem, but the campaign succeeded only in securing some of the coastal cities. Although the Christians would retain a toehold on the coast for much of the 13th century, Acre, their last stronghold, fell to the Muslims in 1291. They were no longer a significant force in Middle Eastern affairs. In retrospect, the Crusades had only minimal importance in the history of the Middle East, although they may have served to unite the forces of Islam against the foreign invaders, thus creating a residue of distrust toward Christians that continues to resonate through the Islamic world today. Far more important in their impact were the Mongols, a pastoral people who swept out of the Gobi Desert in the early 13th century to seize control over much of the known world. Beginning with the advances of Genghis Khan in northern China, Mongol armies later spread across Central Asia, and in 1258, under the leadership of Hulegu, brother of the more famous Kubilai Khan, they seized Persia and Mesopotamia, bringing an end to the caliphate at Baghdad. The Mongols. Unlike the Seljuk Turks, the Mongols were not Muslims, and they found it difficult to adapt to the settled conditions that they found in the major cities in the Middle East. Their treatment of the local population in conquered territories was brutal. According to one historian, after conquering a city, they wiped out not only entire families but also their household pets, and destructive to the economy. Cities were razed to the ground, and dams and other irrigation works were destroyed, reducing prosperous agricultural societies to the point of mass starvation. The Mongols advanced as far as the Red Sea, but their attempt to seize Egypt failed, in part because of the effective resistance posed by the Mamluks, or Mamluks, a Turkish military class originally composed of slaves, who had recently overthrown the administration set up by Saladin and seized power for themselves. Eventually, the Mongol rulers in the Middle East began to assimilate the culture of the peoples they had conquered. Mongol elites converted to Islam, Persian influence became predominant at court, and the cities began to be rebuilt. By the 14th century, the Mongol Empire had begun to split into separate kingdoms and then to disintegrate. In the meantime, however, the old Islamic empire originally established by the Arabs in the 7th and 8th centuries had long since come to an end. The new center of Islamic civilization was in Cairo, now about to promote a renaissance in Muslim culture under the sponsorship of the Mamluks. To the north, another new force appeared on the horizon with the rise of the Ottoman Turks on the Anatolian Peninsula. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II seized Constantinople and brought an end to the Byzantine Empire. Then the Ottomans began to turn their attention to the rest of the Middle East. Andalusia, a Muslim outpost in Europe. After the decline of Baghdad, perhaps the brightest star in the Muslim firmament was in Spain, where a member of the Umayyad dynasty had managed to establish himself after his family's rule in the Middle East had been overthrown in 750 CE. Abd al-Rahman had escaped the carnage in Damascus and made his way to Spain, where Muslim power had recently replaced that of the Visigoths. By 756, he had legitimized his authority in southern Spain, known to the Arabs as Al-Andalus and to Europeans as Andalusia, and taken the title of Emir, commander, with his capital at Cordoba. There he and his successors sought to build a vibrant new center for Islamic culture in the region. With the primacy of Baghdad now at an end, Andalusian rulers established a new caliphate in 929. Now that the Caesar of Crete, Sardinia, Sicily, and the Balearic Islands had turned the Mediterranean Sea into a Muslim lake, Andalusia became part of a vast trade network that stretched all the way from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Red Sea and beyond. Valuable new agricultural products were introduced to the Iberian Peninsula, including cotton, sugar, olives, citrus, and the date palm. Andalusia also flourished as an artistic and intellectual center. The court gave active support to writers and artists, creating a brilliant culture focused on the emergence of three world-class cities, Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo. Intellectual leaders arrived in the area from all parts of the Islamic world, bringing their knowledge of medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. With the establishment of a paper factory near Valencia, the means of disseminating such information dramatically improved, and the libraries of Andalusia became the wonder of their time. Other wonders of the East that now began to become known in Western Europe were glass mirrors and the private bath. One major reason for the rise of Andalusia as a hub of artistic and intellectual activity was the atmosphere of tolerance in social relations fostered by the state. Although Islam was firmly established as the official faith, and non-Muslims were required to pay a special tax and prohibited from proselytizing for their faith, the policy of convivencia, commingling, provided an environment in which many Christians and Jews were able to maintain their religious beliefs and even obtain favors from the court. A time of troubles. Unfortunately, the primacy of Andalusia as a cultural center was short-lived. By the end of the 10th century, factionalism was beginning to undermine the foundations of the emirate. In 1009, the royal palace at Cordoba was totally destroyed in a civil war. 20 years later, the caliphate itself disappeared as the emirate dissolved into a patchwork of city-states. In the meantime, the Christian kingdoms that had managed to establish themselves in the north of the Iberian Peninsula were consolidating their position and beginning to expand southward. In 1085, Alfonso VI, the Christian king of Castile, seized Toledo, one of Andalusia's main intellectual centers. The new rulers continued to foster the artistic and intellectual activities of their predecessors, leading eventually to the spread of such ideas northward to the great cities and universities of Central and Western Europe. To recoup their losses, the Muslim rulers in Seville called on fellow Muslims, the Almoravids, a Berber dynasty in Morocco, for help in halting the Christian advance. Berber mercenaries defeated Castilian forces at Burgos in 1086, but then remained in the area to establish their own rule over remaining Muslim-held areas in southern Spain. A warrior culture with little tolerance for heterodox ideas, the Almoravids quickly brought an end to the era of religious tolerance and intellectual achievement. But the presence of Andalusia's new warlike rulers was unable to stem the tide of Christian advance. In 1215, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to destroy Muslim rule in southern Spain. Over the next 200 years, Christian armies advanced relentlessly southward, seizing the cities of Seville and Cordoba. But a single redoubt of Abd al-Rahman's glorious achievement remained, the remote mountain city of Granada, with its imposing hilltop fortress, the Alhambra. Moorish Spain, an era of cultural tolerance. In standard interpretations of European history, Western historians have usually described the reconquest of southern Spain by the Christian kingdoms in the north as a positive development that freed the Spanish people from centuries of oppressive Muslim rule. In recent years, however, it has become fashionable to point to the Moorish era in Spain. The term Moors is often used to refer to the Muslims in Spain as a period of cultural tolerance, a time of diversity that was followed by the bloody era of the Spanish Inquisition, when the Catholic Church persecuted Muslims, Jews, and Christian heretics for their refusal to accept the true faith. This interpretation has been especially popular since the terrorist attacks in September 2001, as revisionist scholars seek to present a favorable image of Islam to counter the popular perception that all Muslims are sympathetic to terrorism against the West. Some historians, however, argue that this portrayal of the Moorish era as a period of cultural tolerance overstates the case. They point out that even under the relatively benign rule of Abd al-Rahman, true religious tolerance was never achieved, and that, in any case, any such era came to end with the arrival of the Almoravids and the Almohads, a Berber dynasty that supplanted the Almoravids in Andalusia in the 12th century. For historian J. S. Eliot, the era was, at best, one of cultural interaction, which was eventually followed by a hardening of attitudes on both sides of the cultural spectrum. If there was an era of religious diversity in Spain under Muslim rule, it was all too brief. Islamic civilization. Focus question: what were the main features of Islamic society and culture during its era of early growth? As Thomas Lippmann, author of Understanding Islam, has remarked, the Muslim religion is based on behavior as well as belief. Although this generalization applies in broad terms to most major religions, it seems to be particularly true of Islam. To be a Muslim is not simply to worship Allah, but also to live according to His law as revealed in the Quran, which is viewed as fundamental and immutable doctrine, not to be revised by human beings. Thus, in Islamic society, there is no rigid demarcation between church and state, between the sacred and the secular. As Allah has decreed, so must human beings behave. Therefore, Islamic doctrine must be consulted to determine questions of politics, economic behavior, civil and criminal law, and social ethics. Of course, to live entirely by God's law is difficult, if not impossible. Moreover, many issues of social organization and human behavior were not addressed in the Quran or in the Hadith or Sharia. There was therefore some room for differing interpretations of Holy Scripture in accordance with individual preference and local practice. Still, the Islamic world is and has probably always been more homogeneous in terms of its political institutions, religious beliefs, and social practices than most of its contemporary civilizations. Political structures. For early converts, establishing political institutions and practices that conformed to Islamic doctrine was a daunting task. In the first place, the will of Allah, as revealed to His Prophet, was not precise about the relationship between religious and political authority, simply decreeing that human beings should conduct their affairs by mutual consent. On a more practical plane, establishing political institutions for a large and multicultural empire presented a challenge for the Arabs, whose own political structures were relatively rudimentary and relevant only to small pastoral communities. During the life of Muhammad, the problem could be avoided since he was generally accepted as both the religious and the political leader of the Islamic community, the Ummah. His death, however, raised the question of how a successor should be chosen and what authority that person should have. As we have seen, Muhammad's immediate successors were called caliphs. Their authority was purely temporal, although they were also considered in general terms to be religious leaders, with the title of Imam. At first, each caliph was selected informally by leading members of the Ummah. Soon succession became hereditary in the Umayyad clan, but their authority was still qualified, at least in theory, by the idea that they should consult with other leaders. The wealth of Araby, trade and cities in the Middle East. As we have noted, the Abbasid era was probably one of the most prosperous periods in the history of the Middle East. Trade flourished, not only in the Islamic world, but also with China, with the Byzantine Empire, and with the trading societies in Southeast Asia. Trade goods were carried both by ship and by the fleets of the desert, the camel caravans that traversed the arid land from Morocco in the far west to the countries beyond the Caspian Sea. From West Africa came gold and slaves, from China, silk and porcelain, from East Africa, gold, ivory, and rhinoceros horn, and from the lands of South Asia, sandalwood, cotton, wheat, sugar, and spices. Within the empire, Egypt contributed grain, Iraq, linens, dates, and precious stones, Spain, leather goods, olives, and wine, and Western India, pepper and various textile goods. The exchange of goods was facilitated by the development of banking and the use of currency and letters of credit. One of the key reasons for the Arab Empire's emergence as a major participant in the regional trade network was its success in mastering the latest in naval technology. Arab ships, with hulls of teakwood and lateen sails appropriate for the sailing conditions in the Indian Ocean and beyond, were guided to their destinations by the astrolabe, an invention of the Greeks, and the compass, invented in China. Soon Muslim fleets were a familiar feature in the sea lanes from the western Mediterranean to the coast of southern China. In the process, Muslim merchants gradually replaced their Jewish or Persian counterparts in port cities throughout the region. Under these conditions, urban areas flourished. While the Abbasids were in power, Baghdad was probably the greatest city in the empire. But after the rise of the Fatimids in Egypt, the focus of trade shifted to Cairo, described by the traveler Leo Africanus as one of the greatest and most famous cities in all the whole world, filled with stately and admirable palaces and colleges, and most sumptuous temples. Other great commercial cities included Basra, at the head of the Persian Gulf, Aden at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Damascus in modern Syria, and Marrakech in Morocco. In the cities, the inhabitants were generally segregated by religion, with Muslims, Jews, and Christians living in separate neighborhoods. But all were equally subject to the most common threats to urban life: fire, flood, and disease. The most impressive urban buildings were usually the palace for the caliph or the local governor and the great mosque. Houses were often constructed of stone or brick on a timber frame. The larger houses were often built around an interior courtyard where the residents could retreat from the dust, noise, and heat of the city streets. Sometimes domestic animals such as goats or sheep would be stabled there. The houses of the wealthy were often multi-storied, with balconies and windows covered with latticework to provide privacy. The poor in both urban and rural areas lived in simpler houses composed of clay or unfired bricks. The Bedouins lived in tents that could be dismantled and moved according to their needs. The Arab Empire was clearly more urbanized than most other areas of the known world at the time. Yet the bulk of the population continued to live in the countryside, supported by farming or herding animals. Farm productivity increased steadily throughout much of the empire, aided by reservoirs, new crops, and advanced water management techniques such as underground irrigation canals that had first been invented in the region thousands of years previously. During the early stages, most of the farmland was owned by independent peasants, but eventually some concentration of land in the hands of wealthy owners began to take place. Some lands were owned by the state or the court and were cultivated by slave labor, but plantation agriculture was not as common as it would be later in many areas of the world. In the valleys of rivers such as the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Nile, the majority of the farmers were probably independent peasants. A Chinese account described life along the Nile. The peasants work their fields without fear of inundation or droughts. A sufficiency of water for irrigation is supplied by a river whose source is not known. During the seasons when no cultivation is in progress, the level of the river remains even with the banks. With the beginning of cultivation, it rises day by day. Then it is that an official is appointed to watch the river and to await the highest water level, when he summons the people, who then plow and sow their fields. When they have had enough water, the river returns to its former level. Eating habits varied in accordance with economic standing and religious preference. Muslims did not eat pork, but those who could afford it often served other meats, including mutton, goat, poultry, or fish. Fruit, spices, and various sweets were delicacies. The poor were generally forced to survive on boiled millet or peas with an occasional lump of meat or fat. Bread, white or wholemeal, could be found on tables throughout the region except in the deserts, where boiled grain was the staple food. Pasta was probably first introduced to the Italians by Arab traders operating in Sicily. Islamic society. In some ways, Arab society was probably one of the most egalitarian of its time. Both the principles of Islam, which held that all were equal in the eyes of Allah, and the importance of trade to the prosperity of the state certainly contributed to this egalitarianism. Although there was a fairly well-defined upper class, consisting of the ruling families, senior officials, tribal elites, and the wealthiest merchants, there was no hereditary nobility, as in many contemporary societies, and merchants enjoyed a degree of respect that they did not receive in Europe, China, or India. Not all benefited from the high degree of social mobility in the Islamic world, however. Slavery was widespread. Since a Muslim could not be enslaved, the supply came from sub-Saharan Africa or from non-Islamic populations elsewhere in Asia. Most slaves were employed in the army, which was sometimes a road to power, as in the case of the Mamluks, or as domestic servants, who were occasionally permitted to purchase their freedom. The slaves who worked the large estates experienced the worst living conditions and rose in revolt on several occasions. The Islamic principle of human equality also fell short, as in most other societies of its day, in the treatment of women. Although the Quran instructed men to treat women with respect, and women did have the right to own and inherit property, the male was dominant in Muslim society. Polygyny was permitted, and the right of divorce was in practice restricted to the husband, although some schools of legal thought permitted women to stipulate that their husband could have only one wife or to seek a separation in certain specific circumstances. Adultery and homosexuality were stringently forbidden, although such prohibitions were frequently ignored in practice, and Islamic custom required that women be cloistered in their homes and prohibited from social contacts with males outside their own family. A prominent example of this custom is the harem, introduced at the Abbasid court during the reign of Harun al-Rashid. Members of the royal harem were drawn from non-Muslim female populations throughout the empire. The custom of requiring women to cover virtually all parts of their body when appearing in public was common in urban areas and continues to be practiced in many Islamic societies today. It should be noted, however, that these customs owed more to traditional Arab practice than to Quranic law. The culture of Islam. The Arabs were heirs to many elements of the remaining Greco-Roman culture of the Roman Empire, and they assimilated Byzantine and Persian culture just as readily. In the 8th and 9th centuries, numerous Greek, Syrian, and Persian scientific and philosophical works were translated into Arabic and eventually found their way to Europe. As the chief language in the southern Mediterranean and the Middle East, Arabic became an international language. Later, Persian and Turkish also came to be important in administration and culture. The spread of Islam led to the emergence of a new culture throughout the Arab Empire. This was true in all fields of endeavor, from literature to art and architecture. But pre-Islamic traditions were not extinguished and frequently combined with Muslim motifs, resulting in creative works of great imagination and originality. Philosophy and science. During the centuries following the rise of the Arab Empire, it was the Islamic world that was most responsible for preserving and spreading the scientific and philosophical achievements of ancient civilizations. At a time when ancient Greek philosophy was largely unknown in Europe, key works by Aristotle, Plato, and other Greek philosophers were translated into Arabic and stored in a house of wisdom in Baghdad, where they were read and studied by Muslim scholars. Eventually, many of these works were translated into Latin and were brought to Europe, where they exercised a profound influence on the later course of Christianity and Western philosophy. The process began in the 6th century CE, when the Byzantine ruler Justinian shut down the Platonic Academy in Athens, declaring that it promoted heretical ideas. Many of the scholars at the academy fled to Baghdad, where their ideas and the classical texts they brought with them soon aroused local interest and were translated into Persian or Arabic. Later, such works were supplemented by acquisitions in Constantinople and possibly also from the famous library at Alexandria. The academies where such translations were carried out, often by families specializing in the task, were not true universities like those that would later appear in Europe, but were private operations under the sponsorship of a great patron. many of them highly cultivated Persians living in Baghdad or other major cities. Dissemination of the translated works was stimulated by the arrival of paper in the Middle East, brought by Buddhist pilgrims from China passing along the Silk Road. Knowledge of the new technique of block printing, also a recent invention in China, arrived in the Middle East at this time as well. Paper was much cheaper to manufacture than papyrus, and by the end of the 8th century, the first paper factories were up and running in Baghdad. Libraries and booksellers soon appeared, leading one recent scholar to suggest that Abbasid society was the first book culture. What motives inspired this ambitious literary preservation project? At the outset, it may have simply been an effort to provide philosophical confirmation for existing religious beliefs as derived from the Quran. Perhaps, also, the purpose was to train administrators for newly conquered lands in Europe by acquainting them with conditions in those areas. Eventually, however, more adventurous minds began to use the classical texts not only to seek greater knowledge of the divine will but also to seek a better understanding of the laws of nature. Such was the case with the physician and intellectual Ibn Sina, 980 to 1037, known in the West as Avicenna, who in his own philosophical writings cited Aristotle to the effect that the world operated not only at the will of Allah, but also by its own natural laws, laws that could be ascertained by human reason. Avicenna, a native of Balkh, was once imprisoned as punishment for publishing heterodox ideas, but the popularity of his writings caused them to spread nonetheless throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Although Islamic scholars are justly praised for preserving much of classical knowledge for the West, they also made considerable advances of their own. Nowhere is this more evident than in mathematics and the natural sciences. Islamic scholars adopted and passed on the numerical system of India, including the use of zero, and a 9th century Persian mathematician founded the mathematical discipline of algebra, the reduction. Simplified Arabic numerals had begun to replace cumbersome Roman numerals in Italy by the 13th century. In astronomy, Muslims set up an observatory at Baghdad to study the position of the stars. They were aware that the earth was round and in the 9th century produced a world map based on the tradition of the Greco-Roman astronomer Ptolemy. Aided by the astrolabe, an instrument designed to enable sailors to track their position by means of the stars, Muslim fleets and caravans opened up new trading routes connecting the Islamic world with other civilizations, and Muslim travelers such as Al-Masudi and Ibn Battuta provide modern readers with their most accurate descriptions of political and social conditions throughout the Middle East. Muslim scholars also made many new discoveries in optics and chemistry, and with the assistance of texts on anatomy by the ancient Greek physician Galen, c. 180 to 200. CE developed medicine as a distinctive field of scientific inquiry. Avicenna compiled a medical encyclopedia that, among other things, emphasized the contagious nature of certain diseases and showed how they could be spread by contaminated water supplies. After its translation into Latin, Avicenna's work became a basic medical textbook for medieval European university students. Ultimately, though, the spurt of interest in classical philosophy and science throughout much of the Muslim world proved somewhat abortive. The suggestion that reason could build a bridge to faith aroused the ire of traditional Muslim scholars, and although classical works by such ancient writers as Euclid, Ptolemy, and Archimedes continued to be translated, the influence of Greek philosophy began to wane in Baghdad by the end of the 11th century and did not recover. At the same time, The new technique of printing did not spread, perhaps because it allegedly lacked the aesthetic qualities of cursive script or was viewed as inappropriate for the dissemination of the words of Allah. A similar pattern occurred in Spain, where philosophers such as Averroes, whose Arabic name was Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides, Musa ibn Maimun, a Jew who often wrote in Arabic, undertook their own translations and wrote in support of Avicenna's defense of the role of human reason. Both were born in Cordoba in the early 12th century but were persecuted for their ideas by the Almohads, who had replaced the Almoravids in Andalusia, and both men ended their days in exile in North Africa. By then, however, Christian rulers such as Alfonso X in Castile and Frederick II in Sicily were beginning to sponsor their own translations of classical Greek works from Arabic into Latin, whence they made their way to the many new universities sprouting up all over Western Europe. The end result of this period of cultural interaction would be an intellectual revolution that would transform the world of medieval Europe to its very core. Islamic literature. The literature of the Middle East is diverse, reflecting the many distinct cultures of the region. The Arabic and Persian works in particular represent a significant contribution to world literature. Arabic poetry prior to Muhammad extolled the Bedouin experience of tribal life, courage in battle, hunting, sports, and respect for the animals of the desert, especially the camel. Pre-Muslim Persia also boasted a long literary tradition, most of it oral and later written down using the Arabic alphabet. Lacking the desert tradition of the Arabs, Persian writers focused on legends of past kings, Zoroastrian religious themes, romances, fables, and folktales. The transcendent literary monument of early Persian literature is the Book of Lords, an early 6th century compilation of poetry about Persian myths and legendary heroes. Islam brought major changes to the culture of the Middle East, not least to literature. Muslims regarded the Quran as their greatest literary work, but pre-Islamic traditions continued to influence writers throughout the region. Poetry is the Persian art par excellence. The Book of Kings, a 10-volume epic poem by the Persian poet Ferdowsi, 940 to 1020, is one of the greatest achievements of Persian literature. It traces the history of the country from legendary times to the arrival of Islam. Iranian schoolchildren still learn its verses, which serve to reaffirm pride in their ancient heritage. But love poetry remained popular. One notable example was Rabe of Kozdar, Persia's first known woman poet, whose writings in the second half of the 10th century expressed her anguish at the suffering love brings. In the West, the most famous works of Middle Eastern literature are undoubtedly the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and Tales from 1001 Nights, also called the Arabian Nights. Although these two works are not especially popular with Middle Eastern readers, they appealed to the taste of 19th century Europeans who developed a taste for stories set in exotic foreign places, a classic example of the tendency of Western observers to regard the customs and cultures of non-Western societies as strange or exotic. Omar Khayyam's poetry, which he often composed orally over wine at a neighborhood tavern, is simple and down to earth. Key themes are the impermanence of life, the impossibility of knowing God, and disbelief in an afterlife. Among his most popular verses is the famous couplet, "Here, with a loaf of bread beneath the bough, a flask of wine, a book of verse, and thou." Ironically, recent translations of his work appeal to modern attitudes of skepticism and minimalist simplicity that may make him even more popular in the West. In youth I studied for a little while, later I boasted of my mastery. Yet this was all the lesson that I learned, we come from dust, and with the wind are gone. Drink wine by moonlight, darling, for the moon will shine long after this, and find us not. Like Omar Khayyam's verse, the Arabian Nights was loosely translated into European languages and adapted to Western tastes. A composite of folktales, fables, and romances of Indian and indigenous origin, the stories interweave the natural with the supernatural. The earliest stories were told orally and were later transcribed, with many later additions in Arabic and Persian versions. The famous story of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, for example, was an 18th century addition. Nevertheless, the Arabian Nights has entertained readers for centuries, allowing them to enter a land of wish fulfillment through extraordinary plots, sensuality, comic and tragic situations, and a cast of unforgettable characters. Sadi, 1210 to 1292, considered the Persian Shakespeare, remains to this day the favorite author in Iran. His Rose Garden is a collection of entertaining stories written in prose sprinkled with verse. He is also renowned for his sonnet-like love poems, which set a model for generations to come. Sadi was a master of the pithy maxim, a cat is a lion in catching mice, but a mouse in combat with a tiger. He has found eternal happiness who lived a good life, because, after his end, good repute will keep his name alive. When thou fightest with anyone, consider whether thou wilt have to flee from him or he from thee. Such maxims are typical of the Middle East, where the proverb, a one-line witty observation on the vagaries of life, has long been popular. Proverbs are not only a distinctive feature of Middle Eastern verse, especially Persian, but are also a part of daily life. A scholar recently recovered more than 4,000 in one Lebanese village, including the following: He who has money can eat sherbet in hell. From Persia comes the cynical aphorism, trust in God, but tie up your camel. Some Arabic and Persian literature reflected the deep spiritual and ethical concerns of the Quran. The 13th century poet Rumi, for example, embraced Sufism, a form of religious belief that called for a mystical relationship between Allah and human beings. The term Sufism stems from the Arabic word for wool, referring to the rough wool garments that its adherents wore. Converted to Sufism by a wandering dervish, dervishes, from the word for poor in Persian, sought to achieve a mystical union with Allah through dancing and chanting in an ecstatic trance. Rumi abandoned orthodox Islam to embrace God directly through ecstatic love. Realizing that love transcends intellect, he sought to reach God through a trance attained by the whirling dance of the dervish, set to mesmerizing music. As he twirled, the poet extemporized some of the most passionate lyrical verse ever conceived. His faith and art remain an important force in Islamic society today. The Islamic world also made a major contribution to historical writing, another discipline that was stimulated by the introduction of paper manufacturing. The first great Islamic historian was Al-Masudi. Born in Baghdad in 896, he wrote about both the Muslim and the non-Muslim world, traveling widely in the process. His Meadows of Gold is the source of much of our knowledge about the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate. Translations of his work reveal a wide-ranging mind and a keen intellect, combined with a human touch that practitioners of the art in our century might find reason to emulate. Equaling Al-Masudi in talent and reputation was the 14th century historian Ibn Khaldun. Combining scholarship with government service, Ibn Khaldun was one of the first historians to attempt a philosophy of history. Islamic art and architecture. The art of Islam is a blend of Arab, Turkish, and Persian traditions. Although local influences can be discerned throughout the region, the Arabs, with their new religion and their writing system, served as a unifying force. Fascinated by the mathematics and astronomy they inherited from the Romans or the Babylonians, they developed a sense of rhythm and abstraction that found expression in their use of repetitive geometric ornamentation. The Turks made their own contribution with the use of abstraction in figurative and non-figurative designs, while the Persians added their lyrical poetic mysticism. The ultimate expression of Islamic art is to be found in magnificent architectural monuments beginning in the late 7th century. The first great example is the Dome of the Rock, built in 691 to proclaim the spiritual and political legitimacy of the new religion to the ancient world. Set in the Sacred Heart of Jerusalem on Muhammad's holy rock and touching both the western wall of the Jews and the cities. The most revered Islamic monument, sir. Constructed on Byzantine lines with an octagonal shape and marble columns and ornamentation, the interior reflects Persian motifs with mosaics of precious stones. Although rebuilt several times and incorporating influences from both East and West, this first monument to Islam represents the birth of a new art. At first, desert Arabs, whether nomads or conquering armies, prayed in an open court, shaded along the Qibla, the wall facing the holy city of Mecca, by a thatched roof supported by rows of palm trunks. There was also a ditch where the faithful could wash off the dust of the desert prior to prayer. As Islam became better established, enormous mosques, such as the one earlier discussed at Samarra, were constructed, but they were still modeled on the open court, which would be surrounded on all four sides with pillars supporting a wooden roof over the prayer area facing the Qibla wall. Set in that wall was a niche, or mihrab, containing a decorated panel pointing to Mecca and representing Allah. No discussion of mosques would be complete without mentioning the famous 9th century mosque at Cordoba in southern Spain, which is still in remarkable condition. Its 514 columns supporting double horseshoe arches transform this architectural wonder into a unique forest of trees pointing upward, contributing to a light and airy effect. The unparalleled sumptuousness and elegance make the Cordoba Mosque one of the wonders of world art, let alone Islamic art. Since the Muslim religion combines spiritual and political power in one, palaces also reflected the glory of Islam. Beginning in the 8th century with the spectacular castles of Syria, the rulers constructed large brick domiciles reminiscent of Roman design with protective walls, gates, and baths. With a central courtyard surrounded by two-story arcades and massive gate towers, they resembled fortresses as much as palaces. The most impressive remaining Islamic palace is the 14th century Alhambra in Spain. The extensive succession of courtyards, rooms, gardens, and fountains created a fairy tale castle perched high above the city of Granada. Every inch of surface is decorated in intricate floral and semi-abstract patterns. Much of the decoration is done in carved plasterwork so fine that it resembles lace. Since antiquity, one of the primary occupations of women has been the spinning and weaving of cloth to make clothing and other useful items for their families. In the Middle East, this skill reached an apogee in the art of the knotted woolen rug. Originating in the pre-Muslim era, rugs were initially used to insulate stone palaces against the cold as well as to warm shepherds' tents. Eventually, they were applied to religious purposes, since every practicing Muslim is required to pray 5 times a day on clean ground. Small rugs served as prayer mats for individual use, while larger and more elaborate ones were given by rulers as rewards for political favors. Bedouins in the Arabian desert covered their sandy floors with rugs to create a cozy environment in their tents. In villages throughout the Middle East, the art of rug weaving has been passed down from mother to daughter over the centuries. Girls as young as 4 years old took part in the process by helping to spin and prepare the wool shown from the family sheep. By the age of 6, girls would begin their first rug, and before adolescence, their slender fingers would be producing fine carpets. Skilled artisanship represented an extra enticement to prospective bridegrooms, and rugs often became an important part of a woman's dowry to her future husband. After the wedding, the wife would continue to make rugs for home use, as well as for sale to augment the family income. Eventually, rugs began to be manufactured in workshops by professional artisans who reproduced the designs from detailed painted diagrams. Representation of the Prophet Muhammad in painting or in any other art form has traditionally been strongly discouraged. Although no passage of the Quran forbids representational painting, the Hadith warned against any attempt to imitate God through artistic creation or idolatry, and this has been interpreted as an outright ban on any such depictions. Accordingly, with the exception of Persian miniatures, where an earlier style involving human representation survived for a while, most decorations on all forms of Islamic art consisted of Arabic script and natural plant and figurative motifs. Repeated continuously in naturalistic or semi-abstract geometrical patterns called arabesques, these decorations completely covered the surface and left no area undecorated. This dense decor was also evident in brick, mosaic, and stucco ornamentation and culminated in the magnificent tile work of later centuries. Chronology: Islam, the first millennium. Life of Muhammad 570 to 632. Flight to Medina 622. Conquest of Mecca 630. Fall of Cairo 640. Defeat of Persians 650. Election of Ali to Caliphate 656. Muslim entry into Spain c. 710. Abbasid Caliphate 750 to 1258. Construction of city of Baghdad 762. Reign of Harun al-Rashid 786 to 809. Umayyad Caliphate in Spain 929 to 1031. Founding of Fatimid dynasty in Egypt 973. Capture of Baghdad by Seljuk Turks 1055. Seizure of Anatolia by Seljuk Turks 1071. First Crusade 1096. Saladin destroys Fatimid kingdom 1169. Mongols seize Baghdad 1258. Ottoman Turks capture Constantinople 1453. Film and history. The Message, Muhammad, the Messenger of God, 1976. Over the years, countless commercial films depicting the early years of Christianity have been produced in Hollywood. In contrast, cinematic portrayals of the birth of other world religions such as Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam have been rare. In the case of Islam, the reluctance has been based in part on Muslims' traditional prohibition against depicting the face and figure of the Prophet Muhammad. Reactions to depictions of the Prophet in European media in recent years have demonstrated that this issue remains highly sensitive in Muslim communities worldwide. In the 1970 essay, Syrian-American filmmaker Mostafa Akkad, himself a Muslim, was dismayed at the widespread ignorance of the tenets of Islam in Western countries. He therefore sought to produce a full-length feature film on the life of Muhammad for presentation in Europe and the United States. failing to obtain financial help from US sources. He sought aid abroad and finally won the support of the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, and the film was released in both English and Arabic versions in 1976. The film seeks to present an accurate and sympathetic account of the life of the Prophet from his spiritual awakening in 610 to his return to Mecca in 630. To assuage Muslim concerns, neither the figure nor the voice of Muhammad appears in the film. None of his wives, daughters, or sons-in-law appear on screen. The narrative is carried on through the comments and actions of his friends and disciples, notably the Prophet's uncle Hamza, ably played by the American veteran actor Anthony Quinn. The film, shot on location in Libya and Morocco, is a sometimes moving account of the emergence of Islam in early 7th century Arabia. Although it does not dwell on the more esoteric aspects of Muslim beliefs, it stresses many of the humanistic elements of Islam, including respect for women and opposition to slavery, as well as the equality of all human beings in the eyes of God. Muhammad and his followers are shown as messengers of peace who are aroused to violence only in order to protect themselves from the acts of their enemies. Though slow-moving in spots and somewhat lengthy in the manner of the genre, the message, also known as Muhammad, Messenger of God, is beautifully filmed and contains a number of stunning battle scenes. Viewers come away with a fairly accurate and sympathetic portrait of the life of the Prophet and his message to the faithful. Draw their veils over their bosoms. Religion and philosophy. Before the Islamic era, many upper-class women greeted men on the street, entertained their husbands' friends at home, went on pilgrimages to Mecca, and even accompanied their husbands to battle. Such women were neither veiled nor secluded. Muhammad, however, specified that his own wives, who, according to the Quran, were not like any other women, should be modestly attired and should be addressed by men from behind a curtain. Over the centuries, Muslim theologians, fearful that female sexuality could threaten the established order, interpreted Muhammad's references to modest attire and curtains to mean that all Muslim women should remain in segregated seclusion and conceal their bodies. In fact, one strict scholar in 14th century Cairo went so far as to prescribe that, ideally, a woman should leave her home only 3 times in her life, on entering her husband's home after marriage, after the death of her parents, and after her own death. In traditional Islamic societies, veiling and seclusion were more prevalent among urban women than among their rural counterparts. The latter, who worked in the fields and rarely saw people outside their extended family, were less restricted. In this excerpt from the Quran, women are instructed to guard their modesty and draw veils over their bosoms. Nowhere in the Quran, however, does it stipulate that women should be sequestered or covered from head to toe. Quran, Surah 24, the Light. And say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and guard their modesty, that they should not display their beauty and ornaments except what must ordinarily appear thereof, that they should draw their veils over their bosoms and not display their beauty except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers or their brothers' sons, or their sisters' sons, or their women, or the slaves whom their right hand possesses, or male servants free of physical needs, or small children who have no sense of the shame of sex, and that they should not strike their feet in order to draw attention to their hidden ornaments. How does the role of women in Islam compare with what we have seen in other traditional societies, such as India, China, and the Americas? The spread of the Muslim faith, religion and philosophy. Like Christianity, Islam is not an exclusive religion intended solely for members of a particular social or ethnic group, but is universalist in form, with all humans eligible to join the ranks of the believers. As a result, the sacred books of both religions, the Bible and the Quran, contain passages that encourage the spread of faith by whatever means are necessary and appropriate. In this selection from the Quran, Muslims are called upon to take part in the proselytizing effort, sometimes known in Arabic as jihad. While the vast majority of Muslims today believe that conversion to Islam should only take place by peaceful means, militants cite this passage from chapter 47 as justification for their decision to make war on unbelievers. The Quran, chapter 47, Muhammad, revealed at Medina. Allah will bring to nothing the deeds of those who disbelieve and debar others from His path. As for the faithful who do good works and believe in what is revealed to Muhammad, which is the truth from their Lord, He will forgive them their sins and ennoble their state. This, because the unbelievers follow falsehood, while the faithful follow the truth from their Lord. Thus Allah coins their sayings for mankind. When you meet the unbelievers in the battlefield, strike off their heads. When you have laid them low, bind your captives firmly. Then grant them their freedom or take ransom from them, until war shall lay down her armor. Thus shall you so. Had Allah willed, He could Himself have punished them, but He has ordained it thus that He might test you, the one by the other. As for those who are slain in the cause of Allah, He will not allow their works to perish. He will vouchsafe them guidance and ennoble their state. He will admit them to the paradise He has made known to them. Believers, if you help Allah, Allah will help you and make you strong. But the unbelievers shall be consigned to perdition. He will bring their deeds to nothing. Because they opposed His revelations, He will frustrate their works. Have they never journeyed through the land and seen what was the end of those who have gone before them? Allah destroyed them utterly. A similar fate awaits the unbelievers because Allah is the protector of the faithful. Because the unbelievers have no protector. Allah will admit those who embrace the true faith and do good works to gardens watered by running streams. The unbelievers take their fill of pleasure and eat as the beasts eat, but hell shall be their home. This is the paradise which the righteous have been promised. There shall flow in it rivers of unpolluted water, and rivers of milk forever fresh, rivers of delectable wine, and rivers of clearest honey. They shall eat therein of every fruit, and receive forgiveness from their Lord. Is this like the lot of those who shall abide in hell forever, and drink scalding water which will tear their bowels? Know that there is no God but Allah. Implore Him to forgive your sins, and to forgive the true believers, men and women. Allah knows your busy haunts and resting places. According to this passage, what is the fate of those who adhere to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad? How should unbelievers be treated? The Siege of Jerusalem, a Christian perspective. Religion and philosophy. During the First Crusade, Christian knights laid siege to Jerusalem in June 1099. The following excerpt is taken from an account by Fulcher of Charters, who accompanied the Crusaders to the Holy Land. Fulcher of Charters, Chronicle of the First Crusade. Then the Franks entered the city magnificently at the noonday hour on Friday, the day of the week when Christ redeemed the whole world on the cross. With trumpets sounding and with everything in an uproar, exclaiming, "Hell, God," they vigorously pushed into the city, and straightway raised the banner on the top of the wall. All the heathen, completely terrified, changed their boldness to swift flight through the narrow streets of the quarters. The more quickly they fled, the more quickly they put to flight. Count Raymond and his men, who were bravely assailing the city in another section, did not perceive this until they saw the Saracens, Muslims, jumping from the top of the wall. Seeing this, they joyfully ran to the city as quickly as they could and helped the others pursue and kill the wicked enemy. Then some, both Arabs and Ethiopians, fled into the Tower of David. Others shut themselves in the temple of the Lord and of Solomon, where in the halls a very great attack was made on them. Nowhere was there a place where the Saracens could escape swordsmen. On the top of Solomon's temple, to which they had climbed in fleeing, many were shot to death with arrows and cast down headlong from the roof. Within this temple, about 10,000 were beheaded. If you had been there, your feet would have been stained up to the ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I tell? Not one of them was allowed to live. They did not spare the women and children. What happened to the inhabitants of Jerusalem when the Christian knights captured the city? How do you explain the extreme intolerance and brutality of the Christian knights? A pilgrimage to Mecca. Religion and philosophy. The pilgrimage to Mecca, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is the duty of every Muslim. Ibn Jubair, a 12th century Spanish Muslim who was an ardent proponent of the view that Andalusian Islam had now become the leading force in global Islam with the decline of the Abbasids, left a description of his trip in his journal. The work is famous for its vivid and abundant detail. In this almost lyrical passage, Ibn Jubair tells of reaching his final destination, the Kaaba at Mecca, containing the Black Stone. The Karmata were an extremist religious sect in 9th and 10th century Mesopotamia. Ibn Jubair, the travels of Ibn Jubair. The blessed Black Stone is encased in the corner of the Kaaba facing east. The depth to which it penetrates, it is not known, but it is said to extend 2 cubits into the wall. Its breadth is 2/3 of a span, its length 1 span, and a finger joint. It has 4 pieces joined together, and it is said that it was the Karmata, may God curse them, who broke it. Its edges have been braced with a sheet of silver whose white shines brightly against the black sheen and polished brilliance of the stone, presenting the observer a striking spectacle which will hold his gaze. The stone, when kissed, has a softness and moistness which so enchants the mouth that he who puts his lips to it would wish them never to be removed. This is one of the special favors of divine providence, and it is enough that the Prophet, may God bless and preserve him, declare it to be a covenant of God on each. May God profit us by the kissing and touching of it. By his favor may all who yearn fervently for it be brought to it. In the sound piece of the stone, to the right of him who presents himself to kiss it, is a small white spot that shines and appears like a mole on the blessed surface. Concerning this white mole, there is a tradition that he who looks upon it clears his vision, and when kissing it one should direct one's lips as closely as one can to the place of the mole. What are the other pillars of Islam? How does each task contribute to making a good Muslim? Sage advice from father to son. Politics and government. Tahir ibn Hussein was born into an aristocratic family in Central Asia and became a key political advisor to Al-Mamun, the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad, in the early 9th century. Appointed in 821 to a senior position in Khorasan, a district near the city of Herat, in what is today Afghanistan, he wrote the following letter to his son, giving advice on how to wield authority most effectively. The letter so impressed Al-Mamun that he had it widely distributed throughout his bureaucracy. Letter of Tahir ibn Hussein. Look carefully into the matter of the land tax, which the subjects have an obligation to pay. Divide it among the taxpayers with justice and fairness, with equal treatment for all. Do not remove any part of the obligation to pay the tax from any noble person just because of his nobility, or any rich person because of his richness, or from any of your secretaries or personal retainers. Do not require from anyone more than he can bear, or exact more than the usual rate. The ruler should also devote himself to looking after the affairs of the poor and destitute, those who are unable to bring their complaints of ill treatment to you personally, and those of wretched estate who do not know how to set about claiming their rights. Turn your attention to those who have suffered injuries and their orphans and widows, and provide them with allowances from the state treasury, following the example of the commander of the faithful. May God exalt him in showing compassion for them and giving them financial support, so that God may thereby bring some alleviation into their daily lives, and by means of it bring you the spiritual food of His blessing and an increase of His favor. Give pensions from the state treasury to the blind, and give higher allowances to those who know of the Quran, or most of it by heart. Set up hospices where sick Muslims can find shelter, and appoint custodians for these places who will treat the patients with kindness, and physicians who will cure their illnesses. Keep an eye on the officials at your court and on your secretaries. Give them each a fixed time each day when they can bring you their official correspondence and any documents requiring the ruler's signature. They can let you know about the needs of the various officials and about all the affairs of the provinces you rule over. Then devote all your faculties, ears, eyes, understanding, and intellect to the business they set before you, consider it, and think about it repeatedly. Finally, take those actions which seem to be in accordance with good judgment and justice. How does Tahir's advice compare with that given in the political treatise Arthasastra, discussed in chapter 2? Would his advice serve as an effective model for political leadership today? Comparative essay. Trade and civilization. Interaction and exchange. In 2002, archaeologists unearthed the site of an ancient Egyptian port city on the shores of the Red Sea. Established sometime during the first millennium BCE. The city of Berenik linked the Nile River Valley with ports as far away as the island of Java in Southeast Asia. The discovery of Berenik is only the latest piece of evidence confirming the importance of interregional trade in the ancient world. The exchange of goods between far-flung societies became a powerful engine behind the rise of advanced civilizations throughout the ancient world. Raw materials such as copper, tin, and obsidian, items of daily necessity such as salt, fish, and other foodstuffs, and luxury goods including gold, silk, and precious stones passed from one end of the Eurasian supercontinent to the other, across the desert from the Mediterranean Sea to sub-Saharan Africa. A similar network extended throughout much of the Americas. Less well known, but also important, was the maritime trade that stretched from the Mediterranean across the Indian Ocean to port cities on the distant coasts of Southeast and East Asia. During the first millennium CE, the level of interdependence among human societies intensified as three major trade routes across the Indian Ocean, along the Silk Road, and by caravan across the Sahara created the framework of a single system of trade. The new global network was not only commercial but informational as well, transmitting technology and ideas such as the emerging religions of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam to new destinations. There was a close relationship between missionary activities and trade. Buddhist merchants first brought the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama to China, and Muslim traders carried Muhammad's words to Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Indian traders carried Hindu beliefs and political institutions to Southeast Asia. What caused the rapid expansion of trade during this period? One key factor was the introduction of technology to facilitate transportation. The development of the compass, improved techniques in map-making and shipbuilding, and greater knowledge of wind patterns all contributed to the expansion of maritime trade. Caravan trade, once carried by wheeled chariots or on the backs of oxen, now used the camel as the preferred beast of burden through the deserts of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Another reason for the expansion of commerce during this period was the appearance of several multinational empires that created zones of stability and affluence in key areas of the Eurasian landmass. Most important were the emergence of the Abbasid Empire in the Middle East and the prosperity of China during the Tang and Song dynasties. The Mongol invasions in the 13th century temporarily disrupted the process, but then established a new era of stability that fostered long-distance trade throughout the world. The importance of interregional trade as a crucial factor in promoting the growth of human civilizations can be highlighted by comparing the social, cultural, and technological achievements of active trading states with those communities that have traditionally been cut off from contacts with the outside world. We shall encounter many of these communities in later chapters. Even in the Western Hemisphere, where regional trade linked societies from the Great Plains of North America to the Andes Mountains in present-day Peru, geographic barriers limited the exchange of inventions and ideas, placing these societies at a distinct disadvantage when the first contacts with peoples across the oceans occurred at the beginning of the modern era. What were the chief factors that led to the expansion of interregional trade during the first millennium CE? What role did Islamic peoples play in this process? The gift of the robe. Interaction and exchange. Ibn Battuta, 1304 to 1377, a travel writer born in the Moroccan city of Tangier, is often described as the Muslim equivalent of his famous Italian counterpart Marco Polo. Over the course of a quarter of a century, he voyaged widely throughout Africa and Asia, logging over 75,000 miles in the process. The fascinating personal account of his travels is a prime source of information about his times. In the excerpt presented here, he describes a visit to the city of Bahlak, one of the fabled caravan stops on the Silk Road as it passed through Central Asia. The travels of Ibn Battuta. After a journey of a day and a half over a sandy desert in which there was no house, we arrived at the city of Balkh, which now lies in ruins. It has not been rebuilt since its destruction by the cursed Genghis Khan. The situation of its buildings is not very discernible, although its extent may be traced. It is now in ruins and without society. Its mosque was one of the largest and handsomest in the world. Its pillars were incomparable, 3 of which were destroyed by Genghis Khan because it had been told him that the wealth of the mosque lay concealed under them, provided as a fund for its repairs. When, however, he had destroyed them, nothing of the kind was to be found, the rest. Therefore he left as they were. The story about this treasure arose from the following circumstance. It is said that one of the caliphs of the house of Abbas was very much enraged at the inhabitants of Balkh on account of some accident which had happened, and, on this account, sent a person to collect a heavy fine from them. Upon this occasion, the women and children of the city betook themselves to the wife of their then governor, who, out of her own money, built this mosque, and to her they made a grievous complaint. She accordingly sent to the officer, who had been commissioned to collect the fine, a robe very richly embroidered and adorned with jewels, much greater in value than the amount of the fine imposed. This, she requested might be sent to the Caliph as a present from herself, to be accepted instead of the fine. The officer accordingly took the robe and sent it to the Caliph, who, when he saw it, was surprised at her liberality, and said, "This woman must not be allowed to exceed myself in generosity." He then sent back the robe and remitted the fine. When the robe was returned to her, she asked whether a look of the Caliph had fallen upon it, and being told that it had, she replied, "No robe shall ever come upon me, upon which the look of any man, except my own husband, has fallen." She then ordered it to be cut up and sold, and with the price of it she built the mosque, with the cell and structure in the front of it. Still, from the price of the robe there remained a third, which she commanded to be buried under one of its pillars, in order to meet any future expenses which might be necessary for its repairs. Upon Genghis Khan's hearing this story, he ordered these pillars to be destroyed, but, as already remarked, he found nothing. Would a Muslim observer have considered the actions of the governor's wife described here to be meritorious? Why or why not? Comparative illustration. Science and technology. A 12th century map of the world. The 12th century Muslim geographer Al-Idrisi received his education in the Spanish city of Cordoba while it was under Islamic rule. Later he served at the court of the Norman king of Sicily, Roger II, where he created an atlas of the world based on Arab and European sources. In Muslim practice at the time, north and south were inverted from modern practice. Al-Idrisi's map, shown above, depicts the world as it was known at that time, stretching from the Spanish peninsula on the right to the civilization of China on the far left. It is also a testimonial to the vast extension of the power and influence of Islam in the 5 centuries since the death of Muhammad in 632. Maps drawn by Al-Idrisi's European contemporaries were still highly stylized, with the Christian holy city of Jerusalem placed at the center of the world, as in the map shown at the left. How much of the world shown on the map above was explored by Muslim fleets? Love for a camel. Art and ideas. Early Arabic poetry focused on simple pleasures such as wine, women, song, and the faithful camel. This excerpt is from a longer work by the 6th century Arab poet Tarafa. Tarafa was one of a group of 7 poets called the Suspended Ones. Their poems, having won a prize in an annual competition, were suspended on a wall for all to read. The Ode of Tarafa. Ah, but when grief assails me, straightway I ride it off mounted on my swift, lean-flanked camel, night and day racing. Her long neck is very erect when she lifts it up, calling to mind the rudder of a Tigris-bound vessel. Her skull is most like an anvil, the junction of its 2 halves meeting together as it might be on the edge of a file. Her cheek is smooth as Syrian parchment, her split lip a tan hide of Yemen, its slit not bent crooked. Her eyes are a pair of mirrors, sheltering in the caves of her brow bones, the rock of a pool's hollow. I am at her with the whip, and my she-camel quickens pace what time the mirage of the burning stone-track shimmers. Elegantly she steps, as a slave girl at a party will sway, showing her master skirts of a trailing white gown. I am not one that skulks fearfully among the hilltops, but when the folk seek my succor, I gladly give it. If you look for me in the circle of the folk, you will find me there, and if you hunt me in the taverns, there you will catch me. Come to me when you will, I'll pour you a flowing cup. And if you don't need it, well, do without, and good luck to you. Whenever the tribe is assembled, you will come upon me at the summit of the noble house, the oft frequented. My boon companions are white as stars, and the singing winch comes to us in her striped gown or her saffron robe, while the opening of her collar, dedicate her skin to my companion's fingers, tender her nakedness. When we say, let's hear from you, she advances to us chanting fluently, her glance languid in effortless song. How does this poem celebrate the secular aspects of life? Chapter summary. After the collapse of Roman power in the West, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued in the Eastern Mediterranean and eventually emerged as the unique Christian civilization known as the Byzantine Empire, which flourished for hundreds of years. One of the greatest challenges to the Byzantine Empire, however, came from a new force, Islam, that blossomed in the Arabian Peninsula and spread rapidly throughout the Middle East. In the eyes of some Europeans during the Middle Ages, the Arab Empire was a malevolent force that posed a serious threat to the security of Christianity. Their fears were not entirely misplaced, for within a century after the death of Islam's founder, Muhammad, Arab armies overran Christian states in North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, and Turkish Muslims moved eastward onto the fringes of the Indian subcontinent. But although the teachings of Muhammad brought war and conquest to much of the known world, they also brought hope and a sense of political and economic stability to peoples throughout the region. Thus, for many people in the medieval Mediterranean world, the arrival of Islam was a welcome event. Islam brought a code of law and a written language to societies that had previously lacked them. Finally, by creating a revitalized trade network stretching from West Africa to East Asia, it established a vehicle for the exchange of technology and ideas that brought untold wealth to thousands and a better life to millions. Like other empires in the region, the Arab Empire did not last. It fell victim to a combination of internal and external pressures, and by the end of the 13th century, it was no more than a memory. But it left a powerful legacy in Islam, which remains one of the great religions of the world. In succeeding centuries, Islam began to penetrate into new areas beyond the edge of the Sahara and across the Indian Ocean into the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. Chapter